In the scorching desert sands near Memphis, archaeologists discovered something that defied every understanding of ancient Egyptian history. Hidden beneath layers of deliberately buried stones, they found hieroglyphs that spoke of a pharaoh who claimed his divine blood came not from Ra, the sun god, but from beings who descended from the stars above. This ruler, known as Khaemwaset III, left behind inscriptions so disturbing that ancient priests tried to erase every trace of his existence. For over 3,000 years, his name was forbidden to be spoken aloud in any temple across the Nile. What drove an entire civilization to systematically destroy the memory of one of their own divine kings? Before we continue with the story of this mysterious pharaoh and his impossible claims, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from ancient Egypt. The truth about Khaemwaset's reign would challenge everything we thought we knew about the beliefs of the ancient world. The year was 1323 before Christ, during the twilight of the 19th dynasty. Egypt had endured decades of political upheaval following the heretical reign of Akhenaten and the mysterious death of the boy king Tutankhamun. The great pharaoh Ramesses II had been dead for 12 years, and his successors struggled to maintain the empire he had built through conquest and diplomacy. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, life continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers tended their fields of barley and emmer wheat, watching anxiously as the annual floodwaters receded to reveal the rich black soil that sustained their civilization. In the bustling markets of Memphis, merchants hawked their wares beneath colorful linen awnings. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted duck, and the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in the Egyptian heat. Scribes sat cross-legged in the shade of palm trees, their reed pens scratching hieroglyphs onto precious papyrus scrolls. Children played with clay toys shaped like crocodiles and cats, while their mothers ground grain on stone querns, the rhythmic sound echoing through narrow alleyways. The great temple of Ptah dominated the city's skyline, its massive pylons casting long shadows across the sacred precincts, where priests performed the daily rituals that kept the cosmos in balance. These holy men, with their shaved heads gleaming with oil and their white linen kilts pristine despite the desert climate, maintained strict schedules of offerings and prayers. They believed, as all Egyptians did, that their pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus on earth, descended from the gods themselves through an unbroken chain of divine bloodlines stretching back to the first dynasty. But in the royal palace, something was terribly wrong. The current pharaoh, Meneptah, had been acting strangely for months. Court officials whispered in the corridors about his erratic behavior, his sudden fascination with astronomical calculations, and his disturbing claims during private audiences. The vizier, a cautious man named Hori, had begun keeping detailed records of the pharaoh's statements, fearing that madness might have taken hold of the divine ruler. Palace guards reported seeing strange lights in the pharaoh's quarters late at night, accompanied by sounds they could not identify, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the ancient walls. The common people remained largely unaware of these troubling developments. They went about their daily lives, trusting in the eternal order of things that had sustained their ancestors for over 2,000 years. Fishermen cast their nets into the Nile's muddy waters at dawn, bringing in catches of perch and catfish to feed the growing population. Artisans in their workshops carved intricate amulets from stone and precious metals, each one inscribed with protective spells that would guard the wearer in both life and death. In the evening, families gathered around clay ovens to share their simple meals of bread, onions, and beer made from fermented barley. Mothers told their children the ancient stories of the gods, how Osiris had been murdered by his jealous brother Set, how Isis had used her magic to resurrect her husband and conceive the god Horus, who would grow up to reclaim his father's throne and establish the divine right of pharaohs to rule Egypt. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the very foundation of Egyptian society, explaining why the pharaoh possessed godlike powers and why his word was absolute law. The priests at Memphis had begun to notice troubling omens. During the morning ritual to awaken Ptah, the sacred bull Apis had refused to eat the specially prepared offerings, instead bellowing mournfully as if in distress. The sacred ibis birds, normally calm and stately in their movements around the temple precincts, had been seen flying in agitated circles, their harsh cries piercing the usually serene atmosphere of prayer and meditation. Even more disturbing were the reports from the temple astronomers, who spent their nights on the flat rooftops, studying the movements of the stars and planets that governed earthly affairs. They claimed that certain constellations had shifted from their appointed places in the sky, though their colleagues dismissed such observations as the result of tired eyes and too many sleepless nights bent over star charts. As autumn approached and the Nile's floodwaters continued their slow retreat, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. The harvest would soon begin, that crucial time when the success or failure of crops would determine whether the coming year brought prosperity or famine. But for the first time in living memory, many Egyptians found themselves looking not toward the rich black soil of their fields, but upward at the vast expanse of stars that wheeled overhead in the desert night, wondering what strange forces might be watching them from the infinite darkness between worlds. The transformation began on the night of the autumn equinox, when the hours of daylight and darkness stood in perfect balance. Palace guards later described seeing an eerie blue light emanating from the pharaoh's private chambers, unlike anything they had witnessed before, not the warm glow of oil lamps or the flickering dance of torch flames, but something cold and steady that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The light was accompanied by that strange humming sound that had plagued the palace for weeks, now so intense that sleeping servants woke in terror, clutching their amulets and whispering protective spells. When dawn broke over the eastern desert, Merneptah emerged from his chambers completely changed. The man who had ruled Egypt for nearly a decade was gone, replaced by someone, or something, that wore his face but spoke with an alien voice. His first act was to summon the high priest of Ptah and declare that everything the Egyptians believed about their gods was incomplete. According to the transformed Pharaoh, the deities their ancestors had worshipped for millennia were merely servants of far greater beings who dwelt among the stars. "The ones you call gods are nothing more than messengers," Merneptah announced during a hastily convened court session, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made listeners' skin crawl. "They serve the true masters, those who crossed the void between worlds before your civilization learned to stack stone upon stone. I am their chosen vessel, sent to prepare this land for their return." The assembled nobles and priests exchanged horrified glances, unsure whether they were witnessing divine revelation or dangerous heresy. The pharaoh's appearance had altered subtly overnight. His eyes now held an unsettling intensity, seeming to reflect light like polished obsidian, and his movements possessed an unnatural precision that suggested he was learning to control an unfamiliar body. When he spoke, he used Egyptian words but arranged them in patterns that sounded foreign, as if the language itself was being filtered through an alien intelligence. Within days, Merneptah began issuing decrees that shocked the kingdom. He commanded the construction of massive stone platforms in the desert, aligned not with traditional Egyptian astronomical observations, but according to star maps he claimed to have received in visions. These structures were unlike anything ever built in Egypt, not pyramids or temples, but flat surfaces covered in intricate geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Thousands of workers were conscripted to quarry limestone and granite, while skilled craftsmen were ordered to carve symbols that bore no resemblance to hieroglyphs. The pharaoh's behavior during official ceremonies became increasingly bizarre. During the traditional daily ritual where he was supposed to commune with Ra at sunrise, witnesses reported that he would stand motionless for hours, his face turned not toward the sun, but toward specific points in the sky that seemed to shift from day to day. He stopped eating the foods that had sustained pharaohs for centuries: fine bread, roasted fowl, honey cakes, and imported wine, instead consuming only water mixed with strange powders that his servants were forbidden to examine. Most disturbing of all were his private audiences with foreign dignitaries and provincial governors. Multiple witnesses reported that during these meetings, Merneptah would suddenly stop speaking Egyptian entirely, instead producing sounds that resembled no known human language. These episodes could last for several minutes, during which the pharaoh's body would remain perfectly still, while the alien vocalizations filled the chamber. When he returned to normal speech, he would continue conversations as if nothing unusual had occurred, though he often displayed knowledge of distant events that should have been impossible for him to know. The high priest Amenemheb, a man who had served 3 pharaohs with unwavering loyalty, finally worked up the courage to confront his divine ruler about these changes. The meeting took place in the sacred chamber beneath the temple of Ptah, where pharaohs had received guidance from the gods since time immemorial. What transpired during that private audience was never fully recorded, but when Amenemheb emerged hours later, his hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook uncontrollably. "He showed me things," the priest whispered to his most trusted colleagues. "Visions of what lies beyond the sky, of beings that watch us as we watch ants in the sand. He claims his body is merely a dwelling place, that the real Merneptah died that night when the blue light came. Something else wears his flesh now, something that has crossed the darkness between worlds." News of the pharaoh's transformation spread through Egypt like wildfire, carried by merchants, soldiers, and refugees who fled the capital in growing numbers. In remote villages along the Nile, farmers abandoned their fields to build shrines facing the stars rather than the sun. Some embraced the pharaoh's claims, believing that the gods had finally chosen to reveal their true nature. Others saw his behavior as the gravest blasphemy imaginable, a corruption of the divine order that had sustained their civilization for 3,000 years. The kingdom that had once been united under the divine authority of the pharaoh began to fracture as regional governors questioned whether they owed allegiance to a ruler who claimed to serve alien masters rather than Egyptian gods. In the south, the governor of Thebes refused to send tribute, declaring that the being in Memphis was not the true pharaoh, but an impostor or demon wearing royal vestments. Military units began deserting their posts, unwilling to serve a commander whose loyalties lay with entities from beyond the stars. As summer turned to autumn, it became clear that Egypt faced not just a political crisis, but a complete collapse of everything its people had believed about their world and their place within it. The crisis deepened as reports arrived from across the kingdom of phenomena that defied rational explanation. In the ancient city of Thebes, the sacred lake within the temple complex began glowing with the same blue light that had first appeared in the pharaoh's chambers. Priests who approached the water reported that their reflections showed not their own faces, but those of strangers with elongated features and eyes like polished stone. The effect was so disturbing that the high priest ordered the lake covered with reed mats, though the eerie glow still seeped through at night. Similar disturbances plagued other holy sites throughout Egypt. At the temple of Hathor in Dendera, the sacred cow became agitated whenever priests attempted to perform traditional rituals, lowing mournfully and refusing to accept offerings. In the goddess's inner sanctum, hieroglyphs began appearing on walls that had been blank for centuries, not carved by human hands, but somehow burned into the stone, as if by invisible fire. These new inscriptions bore no resemblance to traditional Egyptian writing, consisting instead of geometric patterns and symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The common people, already unnerved by their pharaoh's bizarre behavior, began experiencing collective nightmares. Across the kingdom, Egyptians reported identical dreams of vast ships moving silently through star-filled skies, carrying beings whose very presence inspired both terror and an inexplicable sense of recognition. In these visions, the familiar gods of Egypt, Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Thoth, appeared not as divine rulers, but as servants bowing before entities whose forms the dreaming mind could not fully comprehend. Children were particularly affected by these nocturnal visitations. In villages throughout the Nile Delta, parents reported that their sons and daughters had begun speaking in their sleep, using words that belonged to no earthly language. Even more disturbing, these children showed an uncanny ability to predict events before they occurred, knowing when the Nile would rise or fall, anticipating storms days before they arrived, and identifying strangers by name before meeting them. Some parents, terrified by their offspring's unnatural abilities, sought help from local priests, while others came to believe that their children had been chosen for some cosmic purpose they could not understand. The pharaoh's strange construction projects proceeded at an alarming pace, consuming resources that should have been used to maintain irrigation systems and store grain for the inevitable years when the Nile's flood would fail. The geometric platforms rising from the desert sands now numbered in the dozens, each one precisely positioned according to astronomical calculations that seemed to follow no earthly calendar. Workers reported that the stone structures generated their own sounds at night, low-frequency vibrations that could be felt through the soles of feet, even when the ear could detect nothing. More troubling still were the disappearances. Skilled astronomers, mathematicians, and scribes began vanishing from their homes without explanation, leaving behind only personal belongings and half-finished calculations covered in those same alien symbols that had appeared in the temples. Their families searched desperately, but no trace of the missing men was ever found. Not their bodies, not their possessions, nothing to suggest what fate had befallen them. The vizier Hori, increasingly desperate to understand what had happened to his pharaoh, began conducting his own investigation. Working with loyal palace guards and a handful of priests who still questioned the divine nature of Meneptar's transformation, he discovered that similar events had occurred in Egypt's distant past. Ancient papyri hidden in temple archives spoke of previous pharaohs who had claimed communion with star-dwelling entities, though their reigns had been systematically erased from official records. One particularly disturbing document, written in archaic hieroglyphs during the Old Kingdom period, described a pharaoh who had proclaimed himself the herald of beings who dwelt in the spaces between the stars before Ra first lit the sky. This ancient ruler had commanded the construction of monuments designed to serve as beacons for his cosmic masters, promising that their arrival would usher in a new age of divine rule. His reign had ended abruptly when the high priests of Memphis declared him possessed by demons and ordered his assassination. The parallels to current events were impossible to ignore, suggesting that whatever force had taken hold of Merneptah had attempted similar interventions throughout Egyptian history. Each time, it seemed, the priests and nobles had eventually recognized the threat and taken decisive action to preserve their traditional beliefs and social order. But those previous crises had occurred during periods when royal power was already weakened by succession disputes or natural disasters. Merneptah, in contrast, had been a strong and stable ruler before his transformation, making resistance to his authority much more difficult. As the investigation continued, Hori uncovered evidence that the pharaoh's condition might be spreading to others within the royal court. Several high-ranking officials had begun exhibiting similar symptoms: the cold intensity of gaze, the unnatural precision of movement, the occasional lapses into alien vocalizations. More alarmingly, these individuals seemed to be coordinating their actions in ways that suggested they were receiving instructions from a single source, though they never appeared to communicate directly with each other. The implications were staggering. If the entity controlling Merneptah could spread its influence to others, then the entire Egyptian government might eventually fall under alien control. The kingdom that had stood for 3 millennia as a beacon of human civilization could become something else entirely, a foothold for beings whose intentions toward humanity remained utterly unknown. Time was running out, and the weight of an impossible decision pressed down upon those few officials who still retained their human nature. They could attempt to remove the pharaoh and risk plunging Egypt into civil war, or they could stand by and watch as their entire civilization was transformed into something unrecognizable. Either choice carried the potential for catastrophe, but inaction would certainly doom not just Egypt, but possibly the entire human race to an unthinkable fate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A humble scribe named Khaemwaset, who worked in the palace archives, meticulously copying ancient texts that most scholars considered too damaged or obscure to merit attention. While transcribing a collection of papyri dating to the reign of Djoser, he discovered fragments that seemed to predict the current crisis with disturbing accuracy. The texts spoke of recurring cycles when the Watchers from beyond the void would attempt to establish footholds in the mortal realm, using willing or unwilling human vessels to prepare for larger interventions. According to these ancient sources, the entities existed in a realm between the physical universe and what Egyptians understood as the afterlife, a dimension where consciousness could survive without flesh, where beings of pure thought could observe countless worlds across the vast emptiness of space. They had been watching human civilization since its earliest beginnings, occasionally selecting individuals to serve as conduits for their will when conditions were favorable for their purposes. Khaemwaset's research revealed that these interventions followed astronomical patterns linked to specific stellar alignments that occurred every few centuries. The entities required these cosmic configurations to bridge the gap between dimensions, using celestial energies to sustain their possession of human hosts. More importantly, the ancient texts suggested that their influence could be disrupted if the proper countermeasures were taken during narrow windows of opportunity, when their connection to this realm was weakest. Armed with this knowledge, the scribe approached Vizier Hori with a desperate plan. The next new moon would coincide with a rare conjunction of planets that, according to the ancient calculations, might temporarily weaken the entity's hold on their human vessels. If they could isolate the pharaoh during this brief period and perform specific rituals described in the forgotten texts, they might be able to drive out the alien consciousness and restore Merneptah to his natural state. The plan was incredibly dangerous, requiring them to deceive not only the transformed pharaoh, but also the growing number of court officials who seemed to be falling under similar influence. Hori assembled a small group of trusted individuals, palace guards whose loyalty was absolute, priests who still served the traditional gods rather than the star-dwelling entities, and a handful of nobles whose estates lay far enough from Memphis to have escaped the spreading corruption. Their first step was to create a diversion that would draw the pharaoh away from the protective barriers of his heavily guarded palace. They spread rumors throughout the city that a new star had appeared in the constellation, that the transformed ruler seemed to watch most intently, claiming that astronomical calculations suggested this celestial event heralded the imminent arrival of his cosmic masters. The bait worked perfectly. Merneptah announced his intention to travel to the largest of the desert platforms he had constructed, where he could observe the skies without the interference of palace walls and torchlight. The journey to the remote site would provide the conspirators with their only opportunity to act. They arranged for the royal convoy to include only personnel they trusted, replacing the pharaoh's usual bodyguards with men who understood the true nature of their mission. The challenge would be maintaining the pretense of loyal service while preparing to perform what would technically constitute regicide if their plan failed to restore the true pharaoh. As they traveled across the moonlit desert, the full scope of Merneptah's transformation became apparent to those who observed him closely. The being wearing the pharaoh's body moved with mechanical precision, never showing fatigue despite the scorching heat and the endless miles of shifting sand. It required no food or water, sustaining itself through some unknown means that defied human understanding. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to be receiving constant guidance from an invisible source, occasionally pausing to listen to sounds that no one else could hear. The geometric platform they reached at dawn was larger than any of the structures visible from Memphis, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the early morning light. As the sun rose, the transformed pharaoh took his position at the center of the design and began producing those alien vocalizations that had become so familiar to the palace staff. But this time something answered from the sky above. The response came not as sound but as light, beams of blue energy that descended from specific points among the stars, still visible despite the growing daylight. Where these rays touched the carved symbols on the platform, the stone began to glow with inner fire, creating a network of luminous patterns that extended far beyond what human eyes could perceive. The effect was hypnotic and terrifying, suggesting that the platform served as some kind of communication device designed to bridge the impossible distance between Earth and whatever realm these entities called home. For nearly an hour, the pharaoh maintained his position within this supernatural display, his body completely motionless, while alien energies flowed around him like visible currents of power. The conspirators watched in fascination and growing horror, realizing that they were witnessing preparations for an event that could fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. Whatever the entities planned to do, the transformation of a single pharaoh was clearly just the beginning of a much larger design. When the celestial light show finally ended, Merneptah turned toward his companions with an expression of cold satisfaction that belonged to no human face. "They come," he announced in that strange resonant voice. "The first ships have already begun their journey across the void. Within 7 cycles of the moon, this world will know its true masters." The conspirators felt their hearts sink as they realized the scope of the threat they faced. This was not merely a case of possession or madness that could be cured through traditional healing methods. The entity controlling their pharaoh was part of a coordinated invasion that had been planned for centuries, possibly millennia. The geometric platforms scattered across Egypt were not just communication devices, but landing beacons designed to guide an alien fleet to specific locations where they could establish their dominion over humanity. As they began the journey back to Memphis, Vizier Hori knew that their desperate plan to restore the true pharaoh was no longer enough. Even if they succeeded in driving out the alien consciousness, they would still face the arrival of its masters in less than 7 months. The fate of not just Egypt, But all human civilization now hung in the balance, dependent on the actions of a small group of individuals who possessed ancient knowledge that the rest of the world had forgotten. The return journey to Memphis became a race against time as disturbing reports reached the royal convoy through messenger pigeons and mounted scouts. Across Egypt, the geometric platforms were activating simultaneously, their stone surfaces glowing with increasing intensity each night. In Alexandria, the great lighthouse had begun emitting the same blue energy that characterized the alien communications, its beam now pointing not toward the harbor to guide ships, but straight up into the star-filled sky. More alarming still were the mass disappearances occurring in every major city. Entire families were vanishing overnight, leaving behind only their possessions and strange burn marks on the floors where they had last been seen. Witnesses reported seeing groups of people walking in perfect formation toward the desert platforms, moving with the same mechanical precision that characterized the transformed Pharaoh. These individuals showed no recognition of friends or relatives who tried to stop them, their eyes reflecting light like polished metal as they continued their inexorable march. Vizier Hori realized that the entity controlling Meneptah had been systematically harvesting human consciousness for weeks, possibly months, creating an army of possessed servants to prepare for the arrival of their cosmic masters. The process seemed to accelerate as the platforms gained power, suggesting that the alien influence could spread more easily when multiple communication nodes were active simultaneously. During rest stops on their desert journey, the conspirators noticed subtle changes in their own perceptions and behavior. Some reported dreams filled with geometric patterns and alien landscapes, while others experienced momentary lapses in memory, where they found themselves standing in positions they could not remember assuming. The vizier ordered that no one should sleep alone, and that trusted companions should watch each other for signs of possession. But the precautions felt inadequate against a threat that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. The transformed Pharaoh, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated as they approached Memphis. Several times during the journey, he would suddenly stop and turn his head toward specific points on the horizon, as if listening to distant signals. His alien vocalizations became more frequent and complex, sometimes lasting for hours, while his human escorts waited in uncomfortable silence. During these episodes, the temperature around him would drop noticeably, and electronic phenomena began manifesting. Metal objects would become magnetized, while water in nearby containers would begin moving in unnatural patterns. On the final night before reaching the capital, the conspirators made their last preparations for the ritual that might restore their true pharaoh. Following instructions from the ancient papyri that scribe Kamwaset had discovered, they gathered specific materials: water from the sacred lake at Karnak, salt from the shores of Lake Natron where bodies were prepared for mummification, incense made from resins that had been blessed in the temple of Isis, and most crucially, a small vial of liquid mercury that had been stored in the deepest vaults beneath the Great Pyramid for over 1,000 years. The mercury was the key component, described in the ancient texts as a substance that existed simultaneously in multiple states of matter, making it capable of disrupting the dimensional barriers that allowed alien entities to possess human hosts. The ritual would require them to create a circle of protection around the transformed pharaoh using the other materials, then force him to ingest the mercury while specific incantations were recited during the precise moment when lunar and planetary alignments reached their optimal configuration. As they prepared for what might be their final night alive, disturbing news arrived from Memphis itself. A messenger, barely coherent with exhaustion and terror, reported that the city was in chaos. Thousands of citizens had abandoned their homes to gather around the geometric platform nearest to the capital, where they stood in perfect rows facing the stars. The remaining population had barricaded themselves in their houses, afraid to venture outside after witnessing their neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into emotionless servants of alien masters. Even more troubling was the messenger's report about the royal palace. The building was now surrounded by a dome of blue energy that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. Palace guards who had attempted to breach this barrier had simply vanished, leaving behind only their weapons and armor arranged in neat piles. The few servants who had escaped before the dome formed reported that the interior of the palace had changed dramatically. Rooms had been reconfigured into geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at, while corridors seemed to extend far beyond the building's actual physical dimensions. Vizier Hori knew that they could not delay their attempt any longer. If they waited until reaching Memphis, they would likely find the transformed Pharaoh protected by supernatural barriers that would make their ritual impossible to perform. Their only chance was to act during the remaining hours of darkness, using the natural isolation of the desert to shield their actions from whatever alien intelligence might be monitoring the situation. As the conspirators made their final preparations, they became aware that they were not alone in the desert. Strange lights moved on the horizon, not the warm glow of torches or campfires, but the cold blue radiance that had become associated with the alien presence. These lights seemed to be converging on their position from multiple directions, suggesting that their plans had somehow been detected despite all their precautions. The race was on. They had perhaps an hour before the approaching lights would reach them, barely enough time to perform the complex ritual that might free their pharaoh from alien control. If they succeeded, they would still face the challenge of convincing a confused and possibly traumatized Merneptah to help them find a way to stop the approaching invasion. If they failed, they would likely join the growing ranks of the possessed, their human consciousness subsumed into the collective intelligence that served beings from beyond the stars. With trembling hands, they began to arrange the ritual circle around the transformed pharaoh, who watched their preparations with cold amusement, as if their desperate attempt to save their world was nothing more than an entertaining diversion before the inevitable triumph of his cosmic masters. The ritual began precisely at midnight, when the constellation Orion reached its zenith and cast the longest shadows across the desert sand. Vizier Hori and his conspirators arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the transformed pharaoh, each holding one of the sacred materials that ancient texts claimed could disrupt alien possession. The being wearing Merneptah's body showed no concern at their preparations, instead watching their movements with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing laboratory specimens. As the first incantations began, spoken in archaic Egyptian that predated the pyramids, the temperature around them dropped dramatically. The sand beneath their feet began to vibrate with increasing intensity, while overhead, the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm with their words. The approaching lights on the horizon had reached the outer perimeter of their camp, revealing themselves to be groups of possessed humans moving in perfect formation toward their location. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the transformed pharaoh spoke in that alien voice that had become so familiar and terrifying. "Your species served its purpose long ago. Now you will evolve into something greater, or you will cease to exist entirely." But Khaemwaset, clutching the ancient papyrus that had revealed the ritual, pressed forward with the next phase of the ceremony. The mercury vial caught moonlight and seemed to glow with inner fire as he prepared to force the liquid metal down the pharaoh's throat. According to the texts, this moment would either free Merneptah from alien control or kill him entirely, but either outcome would disrupt the entity's carefully laid plans for invasion. As the scribe approached with the vial, reality itself seemed to buckle around them. The geometric patterns carved into the distant platform began projecting themselves into the air above the desert, creating a three-dimensional maze of light and shadow that stretched from earth to sky. Within these impossible structures, shapes moved that belonged to no earthly geometry, beings whose very existence challenged human perception and sanity. The possessed pharaoh began laughing, a sound that contained harmonics no human throat could produce. "Look upon your new gods," he commanded, and suddenly the conspirators could see them clearly. The entities that had been manipulating human history for millennia. They were not the grotesque monsters that populated nightmare stories, but beings of such perfect mathematical precision that looking at them directly caused physical pain. Their forms shifted constantly between dimensions, appearing sometimes as geometric abstractions, sometimes as creatures of living light, sometimes as vast intelligences that existed as pure thought. "We have been preparing your species for 3,000 years, the entity speaking through Merneptah explained. "Every civilization that rose and fell, every technological advancement, every religious revelation, all carefully orchestrated to bring you to this moment when you would finally be ready to serve our purposes." But as the alien consciousness revealed the scope of its manipulation, something unexpected happened. The possessed humans approaching their position suddenly stopped moving, their mechanical precision faltering, as if they were receiving conflicting signals. The blue energy dome over Memphis began flickering, while across Egypt the geometric platforms started emitting discordant harmonics instead of their usual synchronized patterns. Vizier Hori realized what was happening. By forcing the entity to reveal too much of its true nature, the ritual had created a feedback loop that was disrupting its control over its human servants. The aliens' greatest strength, their perfect coordination and long-term planning, had become a weakness when their network was forced to process contradictory information. Seizing the moment of confusion, Khemwaset lunged forward and managed to force the mercury vial between the transformed pharaoh's lips. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The being wearing Merneptah's body convulsed as if struck by lightning, while the geometric light structures above them began collapsing in on themselves. The possessed humans scattered across the desert fell to their knees, clutching their heads and screaming, as alien consciousness was violently expelled from their minds. But the victory came at a terrible price. As the entity was forced to abandon its human host, it took most of Merneptah's life force with it. The pharaoh collapsed to the sand, his body rapidly aging as if decades were passing in seconds. When Hori reached him, the once mighty ruler of Egypt was barely breathing, his eyes finally showing human recognition, but filled with the knowledge of horrors that no mortal mind should have been forced to witness. "They showed me everything," Merneptah whispered with his dying breath. "The truth about human history, about why we exist, about what they have planned for us. The invasion, and it was never meant to conquer, it was meant to harvest. They need human consciousness to fuel their journey to other worlds, other dimensions. Egypt was just the beginning." With those words, the last legitimate pharaoh of the 19th dynasty died, taking with him secrets that might have allowed humanity to defend itself against future alien interventions. The conspirators had succeeded in disrupting the immediate invasion, but they had also ensured that when the entities returned, and Merneptah's final words suggested they would return, humanity would face them without the knowledge needed to resist effectively. As dawn broke over the desert, Vizier Hori looked at the scattered groups of former possessed humans who were slowly regaining their individual consciousness. Most would remember nothing of their time under alien control, dismissing the experience as fever dreams or religious visions. Egypt would survive this crisis, but it would do so in ignorance of the true threat that had nearly consumed it. The geometric platforms across the kingdom had gone dark, their alien purpose unfulfilled for now. But they remained standing, waiting in the desert like dormant seeds that might someday sprout again when conditions were right for another attempt at harvesting human civilization. In the weeks following the pharaoh's death, Egypt struggled to rebuild both its government and its collective sanity. Vizier Hori, now serving as regent until a legitimate successor could be established, faced the monumental task of explaining Merneptah's bizarre final months without revealing the truth about alien possession. The official story proclaimed that the pharaoh had been afflicted by a rare disease that caused hallucinations and erratic behavior, eventually claiming his life despite the best efforts of royal physicians. The thousands of Egyptians who had experienced possession retained no clear memories of their time under alien control. Most recalled only fragments, strange dreams filled with geometric patterns, unexplained journeys to remote locations, and an overwhelming sense that they had been part of something vast and incomprehensible. Temple priests worked overtime to provide spiritual cleansing rituals for these traumatized citizens, attributing their experiences to demonic interference that had been successfully banished by the power of traditional gods. However, a small number of the formerly possessed retained more detailed memories, and these individuals posed a significant problem for Hori's efforts to maintain stability. They spoke persistently of visions showing Earth as just one world among countless others, where similar harvesting operations had been conducted, describing civilizations that had risen to great heights, only to be consumed entirely by the star-dwelling entities. Some claimed to have seen the future, images of the aliens returning with better preparation, having learned from their failure in Egypt how to more effectively subdue human resistance. To prevent panic and maintain order, Hori was forced to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Working with loyal priests and military commanders, he established a secret program to identify and quietly eliminate those whose memories posed a threat to social stability. These individuals simply disappeared one night, Their families told that they had volunteered for dangerous expeditions to distant lands. It was a necessary betrayal of innocent people, but Hori convinced himself that sacrificing a few dozen lives was preferable to watching Egyptian civilization collapse under the weight of impossible truths. The geometric platforms scattered across the desert presented another challenge. While they had gone dormant after the failed invasion, their alien construction and purpose made them monuments to humanity's brush with cosmic horror. Hori ordered them destroyed, but the strange materials from which they were built proved remarkably resistant to conventional tools. Even bronze weapons strengthened with the finest metallurgy available could barely scratch their surfaces, while attempts to break them apart using sledgehammers and chisels resulted only in the tools themselves being damaged. Eventually, the platforms were buried under massive quantities of sand and stone, their locations marked only in secret documents that Hori stored in the deepest vaults beneath the Great Pyramid. He established a covert order of guardians, drawn from the most trustworthy priests and nobles, whose sole responsibility was to monitor these sites for any signs of renewed activity. These watchers were sworn to absolute secrecy, their knowledge passed down through carefully selected successors who would maintain the vigil across generations. Scribe Kamwaset, whose research had provided the key to defeating the alien presence, faced a terrible choice regarding the ancient papyri that had revealed the ritual of banishment. The documents contained invaluable knowledge about extraterrestrial threats, but they also included detailed information about how the entities operated and what they sought from human civilization. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could be used to invite rather than repel alien intervention. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, Kamwaset made the heartbreaking decision to destroy most of the texts, preserving only fragments that could help future defenders without providing a roadmap for potential collaborators. The succession crisis that followed Meneptah's death was resolved through careful political maneuvering and strategic marriages that united competing noble houses. The new pharaoh Amenmesse was chosen specifically because he had been far from Memphis during the alien crisis and showed no signs of supernatural influence. His reign began with extensive purification rituals and the construction of new temples dedicated to traditional Egyptian gods, emphasizing the kingdom's return to orthodox religious practices. But beneath the surface of restored normalcy, Egypt had been fundamentally changed by its encounter with cosmic horror. Artists began incorporating subtle geometric patterns into their work without understanding why these designs appealed to them. Astronomers found themselves drawn to study stellar configurations that had no traditional significance in Egyptian cosmology. Children born in the years following the crisis displayed an unusual aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning, as if exposure to alien influence had somehow altered human genetic development in ways that would not become apparent for generations. The economic impact of the crisis lasted for years. Resources that should have been used for infrastructure and agriculture had been diverted to construct the geometric platforms, leaving Egypt's irrigation systems in disrepair and grain stores dangerously low. Successive poor harvests, possibly influenced by climatic changes caused by the alien intervention, led to periods of famine that weakened the kingdom's military and political stability. Regional governors who had declared independence during the chaos proved reluctant to fully submit to central authority again, creating persistent tensions that would plague Egypt for decades. Most disturbing of all were the subtle signs that the alien presence had not been completely eliminated. Ships sailing the Mediterranean reported seeing strange lights beneath the water, moving in formation like an underwater fleet heading toward unknown destinations. Caravan traders crossing the desert spoke of hearing voices in the wind that spoke in languages no human throat could produce. Desert nomads brought stories of ruins appearing overnight in locations where no ancient settlements had ever existed, structures that bore the same geometric patterns as the buried platforms. Vizier Hori spent his remaining years documenting everything he could remember about the crisis, creating a secret archive that future generations might consult if the entities returned. He established networks of informants throughout the Mediterranean world, seeking reports of similar phenomena in other lands. His agents brought disturbing news from Mesopotamia, where Babylonian astronomers reported celestial anomalies that matched patterns recorded during Egypt's crisis. Similar reports arrived from Crete, where Minoan civilization had recently suffered a mysterious collapse that some survivors attributed to divine punishment from sky-dwelling gods. The pattern suggested that Earth's encounter with the star-dwelling entities was part of a much larger galactic strategy that spanned multiple civilizations and time periods. Egypt had won a single battle in a war that stretched across millennia, but victory had come at the cost of ignorance about the true scope of the threat facing humanity. As Hori approached the end of his life, he made one final decision that would echo through history. He commissioned the construction of a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx, sealed with mechanisms that could only be opened by someone who possessed both advanced mathematical knowledge and specific information about the alien crisis. Within this chamber, he placed complete records of everything that had transpired, along with detailed instructions for recognizing and resisting future extraterrestrial interventions. The chamber was designed to serve as a time capsule, preserving crucial knowledge until humanity developed the technological and philosophical sophistication needed to confront cosmic threats effectively. Hori included astronomical calculations showing when stellar conditions would next favor alien intervention, giving future defenders a timeline for preparing Earth's defenses. He also documented the weaknesses in alien strategy that had allowed Egypt to survive, hoping that similar tactics might prove effective in future encounters. But perhaps most importantly, he included a warning about humanity's greatest vulnerability in the face of cosmic horror, the tendency to forget traumatic experiences and retreat into comfortable illusions rather than confronting difficult truths. The survival of human civilization, Hori concluded, would ultimately depend not on military strength or technological advancement, but on the courage to remember what others would prefer to forget. What happened during those terrifying months in ancient Egypt was not just a historical curiosity or an entertaining story of supernatural possession. If Vizier Hori's records are accurate, it was humanity's first documented encounter with intelligences that view our entire species as a resource to be harvested when the time is right. The geometric platforms may be buried, the possessed Pharaoh may be long dead, and the immediate crisis may have passed, but the entities themselves continue their patient watch from the spaces between the stars. They have time, all the time in the universe, to refine their methods and prepare for their next attempt. The question that should keep us awake at night is not whether they will return, but whether we will be ready when they do. Our ancestors in ancient Egypt bought us time with their courage and sacrifice, but they also left us a responsibility to use that time wisely. In a world where we routinely communicate with devices that would have seemed like magic to ancient peoples, where we split atoms and explore other planets, perhaps we are finally approaching the level of sophistication needed to take our place in a universe that may be far more crowded and dangerous than we have ever imagined. The stars that so fascinated that transformed Pharaoh are still there, still watching, still waiting. And if you found yourself unable to look away from this story, if certain details seemed strangely familiar or triggered memories you cannot quite place, perhaps you should ask yourself whether the entity's influence on human consciousness ended entirely with that desperate ritual in the Egyptian desert over 3,000 years ago. Let me know in the comments what you think about this incredible piece of hidden history. Have you ever experienced dreams or visions that might connect to these ancient events? And if you want to hear more stories about the hidden truths that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The past has more secrets than you can imagine, and some of them might be more relevant to our present than we dare to believe.